everyone who's brought this event together, to Linda, to Penny and John, and Kat, who just all of this arranging that's been done, to our musical trio, and Will is around here somewhere taking photographs with them over there. Thank you to all of you. Repeat the thanks that I have in here to everyone who was involved in, sort of providing some sort of support and encouragement while I was writing this and getting it published and all that kind of stuff, and especially to people who read the early drafts of it, to Paula and Penny, who gave me feedback on it while it was still in the works and getting to that stage. Thank you to all those people. And then again, another very special thanks to Kat, because this amazing cover art is Kat's work. And this is, of course, thank you to everybody who has come. I mean, I'm absolutely humbled by all of the people who are here for this, and very grateful to all of you for coming. And I will now move on to reading, keeping it, playing it safe from the beginning of the book, so that people won't be too lost in the events, and will enjoy it. Excuse me, sir, would you like to comment on... good morning, ma'am. I'm from the... Hello, would any of you be interested? The answer wasn't always spoken, and it wasn't always polite, but it always boiled down to no. Erasmus Gray sighed and looked around at the village of Macoro with an air of faint, irrational accusation. He couldn't blame anyone else for its decision to come here. He'd never even heard of Macoro before this morning. Probably very few people had. But it was on the mail coach route, so he'd arranged to be dropped off here and to return the same way when the coach came back later in the day. Now he felt like the coach couldn't return fast enough. It wasn't as if he'd had a very positive impression of this place when he first arrived. When he passed the weathered old sign marking the village of Macoro, he'd wondered if the village itself was even still there. What he had eventually found was a circle of run-down houses surrounding a marketplace that had lain dormant for at least a generation. Thatch and timber, both badly rotten in some cases, were much in evidence. Those paths, one couldn't call them streets, but were more than just tracks worn in the dirt, were lined with rough and battered cobblestones, a clear explanation for the broken cart wheels that lay slowly decomposing with the other discarded refuse between houses. The grass that grew so luxuriantly in the countryside beyond the village here popped up in despondent patches. Gray was familiar with the expression one-horse town. This place might rate 2/3 of a horse at best. And while he left Laurentian, the capital city, because he thought he wasn't learning anything much there, half an hour in Macoro had gained him nothing at all. Even now, the few people he saw out and about steered away, pointedly not looking at him, except for those two men who were walking directly towards him, two rather large, armed men. Erasmus Gray started walking. Not too quickly, but quickly enough to outpace the two men who were now following. He turned the corner, not that there were many corners, so that he was so small, and heard the heavy footsteps of the large men come around the corner after him. Gray had some experience in situations like this. His job was to poke his nose into other people's business, so it was only natural that they objected from time to time. He'd been followed through the streets of his home city often, and he picked up some useful instincts for getting himself out of danger. They were, however, instincts that assumed that he was surrounded by several miles of urban sprawl, and not by a small village embedded in a mostly flat expanse of countryside. He tried to keep a cool head. Never let them see you sweat, his colleague Caius had always said when he was starting out. Your job is to fluster them, not the other way around. Well, Gray was now literally sweating, partly due to his brisk walking pace, and partly from what his stupidness feared. But that didn't mean he couldn't turn the situation around. Somehow. Those men were still following. Gray didn't know who they might be, but his instincts told him they didn't mean well. They didn't pick up their pace, or slow down. Gray tried to just keep going, but there wasn't anywhere to go. No wonder his pursuers weren't hurrying. They knew it was only a matter of time, if before he backed himself into a corner. Gray stared at the wall ahead of him, then at the walls to his left and right, wondering for an insane moment whether he could scale any of them. Then something blotted out the light from behind him, and he turned with a sense of inevitability. The two men stood, impassive, their collective bulk effectively blocking off the entrance to the side street. Gray felt a chill, and the fact that he was standing in the two men's shadow was only an indirect cause. "You're right," Gray said to himself. "Stay calm. This can't be that bad. Don't they say the pen is mightier than the sword?" He cleared his throat and gave the two men the best smile he could muster. "Can I interest either of you gentlemen in the exclusive interview?" he ventured. "Your views on our front page. Let the world know your opinions. How about it?" The men glanced at each other, while unslung a dirty open cudgel from his belt. Gray coughed, eyeing the weapon nervously. "That's a no, then," he said. "Mr. Rice wants to see you," one of the men growled. Gray frowned. "Who is Mr. Rice?" he asked. "Mr. Rice is the man who wants to see you," the other man said. Now that he was seeing them from closer to, Gray realized that he was having trouble telling them apart. Brothers, perhaps, or was it just something about their identical, badly tailored dark grey suits that drew the eye away from their faces? Gray was familiar with the power of a uniform to turn individuals into part of a group. Perhaps this Mr. Rice was, too. Gray allowed himself to be led, thinking of it that way, he would feel a little better about the position he was in, back through the streets of Macor. It didn't take long. There weren't very many streets. There wasn't very much Macor. The sign of the town's inn was so rotten as to be unreadable, and hung precariously on one rusted hinge. The interior, by contrast, was in better shape than any other building in town. Not, Gray imagined, because it didn't like it was an inn. The large men ushered Gray inside, locking the sturdy front door behind them. Gray caught a glimpse of a pair of villagers nearby, who were studiously not looking at him as captors. The two men led Gray through the inn's common room to an office at the back, which had probably belonged to the innkeeper before he was finally persuaded to give up on the place. One of the large men knocked quietly. The man who came to open the door was also wearing a suit, but slightly better made than those of his larger associates. He was about the same height as Gray, which made him look small alongside his towering thugs. Where his men were heavily built, he was slim, wiry, and where they gave the impression of being slow, both physically and in the wits department, he had an air of fierce, predatory quickness. He grinned in a way that showed a lot of teeth and not very much cheer. Gold teeth glinted in the lamplight. "I see my town as a visitor," he said, "and one who has not yet been officially welcomed. I hear you've been asking all sorts of questions, Mr. Erasmus Gray," Gray said, giving a small bow, "of the Carrington Courier." "Mr. Gray, then." The man returned the bow, in what seemed to Gray to be an ironic fashion. "Yorick Rice is my name. So good of you to accept my invitation, eh?" "Well, your two friends here delivered it in such compelling terms, Mr. Rice. I really couldn't bring myself to refuse." He followed Rice through the door, noting that the two large men stayed outside. Good. It's hard to find decent help nowadays, don't you find, Mr. Gray?" Mr. Rice grinned again. "Do have a seat. Make yourself at home." Gray sat in the indicated chair in the front of Mr. Rice's office desk. The desk was cluttered with various scraps of paper and writing implements. Rice seemed to be quite proud of his literacy, to whatever degree he possessed it. "Now then," Mr. Rice said, taking his own rather more luxurious seat behind the desk, "I'd like to hear all about you, Mr. Gray, and why it is you've chosen to visit my humble little